Thank you so much for those introductory remarks. I hope you can see my slides, and I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Someone will tell us if not, because I can't see everyone else. But it's great to have so many people on this first in the webinar series, and thank you very much for the invitation to be the first on behalf of climate outreach. And my role at Climate Outreach is as programs and research director. So I look across each of our programs, which focus on different aspects of public engagement and climate change communication. And there's a question that's been pretty central in my mind, I think, during 2020, alongside all the other kind of concerns that I guess most of us have had, feeling worried and unsettled about the health impacts, the economic impacts of this pandemic, was also, I guess, a question that perhaps fewer people were thinking about, but does seem pretty critical as well, which is to ask what's happening with public opinion about climate change at this unprecedented kind of societal moment that we find ourselves in. What I want to do in this presentation is to make the case for what effective engagement looks like, and why it's important. It was important before COVID-19. It's important during COVID-19 if we're sensitive about it, and it's certainly important after the pandemic has passed, which it will one day, even if that feels a long way off at the moment. So I'm looking forward to taking your questions after the presentation. But I'm going to start off by just briefly making the case for why does public engagement with climate change matter? And it might not seem like something you need to be persuaded of. If you're listening into a presentation about public opinion on climate change in the context of COVID, you probably already buy into this. But nevertheless, I think it's only relatively recently that we've seen a kind of acknowledgement amongst policymakers, amongst decision makers on climate change, that actually climate change is as well as being an unprecedented economic, technological, policy transformation, it's fundamentally a social transformation as well. And that, however we get from here to net zero, and as fast as we can, it absolutely has to be one that has people at the heart of it. It has to be grounded in a social mandate that's not restricted to the kind of usual suspects, traditional environmentalists. It has to be something that has buy-in from right across the breadth of society, and that's certainly the kind of starting point for our work at Climate Outreach. If we're going to get to net zero, it's not just tweaks to where we are now. This is new ways of living and new types of policies, and those policies need to be at a minimum not opposed, but ideally we need to see kind of active support for new policies as well. Some people, not everyone, but some people do need to adjust and change their lifestyles and behaviors. Wealthy people in wealthy countries can and should make changes to their lifestyles, the way they travel, the food that we eat, the way we heat our home, and our expectations around energy use in general. So that's squarely about people. If we're going to kind of see policies implemented at scale and last across different political administrations, not get blown around by the political winds, then we need a sustained social mandate that will outlast any particular government. And it's kind of not very well known, but actually under the UNFCCC process, there's something called the ACE dialogues, which is all about the commitment that governments have to engage their citizens on climate change. So there is actually a kind of international obligation for governments to talk to their citizens about climate change, not just to promote their policies and tell them what's going on in terms of low carbon transformations, but as an end in itself to have public engagement as a necessary part of the transformations that we need to go through to get from where we are to where we need to be, which is net zero, as fast as but with people on board. And if you don't get people on board, you run into problems. Some kind of lifestyle change issues, behavior change issues are very identity based. They're grounded in a sense of who people see themselves as being. So the food that we eat, especially around meat for some people, the way that we travel, the kind of liberty and freedom that we have to travel as we wish. These are really, really kind of profound, deep-rooted, value-laden issues. They're not things that can change overnight. And if we get our communication on these issues wrong, we enter into a kind of cultural war territory, and that's obviously not helpful for making progress. So we need people to be bought in, but to be bought in a credible, genuine way. You can see what happens if, you know, policies that might well be a good idea on paper run into public opposition. The Gilets jaunes protests were about a lot than carbon pricing or the price of fuel, but they were sparked by essentially a kind of climate energy policy. And what sits underneath those climate and energy policies is, you know, a range of really deep-rooted sort of political beliefs, a lack of trust in institutions, everything we know about from the populist kind of discourse that we see around us a lot at the moment. And if we want to get past, you know, plastic bags and coffee cups and changing light bulbs as finding a way to think about behavior change, if we think that we actually need to do more than just nudge people into changing their behaviors, then we can't present behaviors and lifestyle changes as being something that can happen without people thinking. We need people to engage, not just with the easy stuff, the simple and painless stuff, but also with more substantial changes around the food that we eat, the way that we use energy at home, the modes that we use to travel, the amount that we travel. And we need to think about these things. We need to engage with the reasons behind behaviors. Otherwise, we won't see kind of spillover from one behavior to another. They'll just be isolated and ultimately insufficient behavioral changes that are not up to the challenge of what we have before us. This is a graph that was produced by the Committee on Climate Change in the UK, looking at the changes that are ahead of us now to get to net zero. But I think this could have been produced for most European countries, certainly, and I'd have thought most countries around the world. And it shows the percentage of changes ahead of us that involve, to some extent, behavioral change or social engagement, social change. Around about 2/3 of what we need to do is kind of grounded in people, either passively supporting policies, actively supporting them, making changes in their own lives. So this is not something that can happen out of sight. The UK has made okay progress so far on the supply side. We've decarbonised our electricity supply primarily, and coal has dropped right down, and renewables have come right up. Still more work to do, but everything that we need to do now is out front. It's not behind the scenes. It involves people, and we can't expect those changes to happen without people supporting them and being brought into them at quite a deep level, because they speak to almost every facet of our lives. And this I've taken from our organizational theory, which kind of explains why we do the work that we do at Climate Outreach, and the way that we frame this, you know, the choice that we have around public engagement, where we could either settle for a weak social mandate, where only a minority of the public really kind of identify climate change as a key priority. They might be concerned, but they don't have a deeper sense of conviction about what that means. And because of that, they don't support transformative climate policies. That political pressure is not there. Corporations don't feel the consumer pressure. High carbon behaviors remain sort of aspirational. The social norms don't change in the way that they need to around high carbon living. Or we create a kind of virtuous circle based on strong public engagement, a strong social mandate that is really broad across society. That means that whoever's in power politically, they feel the pressure, that all corporations understand that their customers want to see change, and that the social norms start to shift and move. And when the social norms start to shift and move, and we see other people who we identify as being like us starting to change what they do, starting to see the benefits of becoming more sustainable, either in their lifestyles or in their jobs or in the policies they support, and that social norm shift really starts to generate its own kind of momentum and catalyzes further changes. And you can see here, this is public opinion in the UK. I'm going to talk across European data and some global data as well, but just for now, a few illustrations of UK data. this is looking back over the last 15 years, taking us up to 2019, so just pre-pandemic. And you can see, an interesting trajectory here. It's not a straight line going upwards of concern, and it's not the case that as soon as people were scientifically aware about climate change, we immediately had, public concern to match it. Public concern was high back in 2005, and it dropped right off at the end of the 2000s. And this is something that you see in other countries as well. And what happened at that time? We had a global recession that really started to bite in 2008, 2009. As a result of that, media attention was pulled away from climate change and political attention. We had a key UN climate change conference, which was seen as, and I think probably rightly seen as, a failure in Copenhagen. Supposedly the last to save the world, but it didn't, and things carried on. The energy was sucked out of a lot of climate campaigns. There were lots of organized denial activities, and you see a real dip in public engagement, public concern around that time. It took another 5 years, maybe up into Paris, for things to recover, and another 5 years after that for levels of climate change concern in the UK to really get up and beyond where they were in 2005. But nevertheless, 2019, 2018, we see levels of climate change concern and engagement using these kinds of survey data measures that we hadn't seen before. So here's some more UK data. This is a project that we partnered with Cardiff University on. So 2019 survey, asking a range of questions about climate change, and we asked people right at the start of this survey, what are the most important issues facing the UK in the next 20 years? Brexit number 1 at the time, climate change number 2, really high. And if you compare that to the same survey asked 3 years before, climate change was right down at number 13, even just 3 years before in the UK. So there's been a big shift, and we can all feel it. In a way, you don't need me to show you these polls to know that 2019 represented a kind of incredible moment, actually, I think, for climate change campaigning. There was such energy in the Extinction Rebellion protests, in the school strikes, Fridays for Future movement, and climate change achieved a kind of salience there and a level of urgency that it hadn't ever had before in the public mind. And this was kind of accompanied by sort of political declarations of climate emergencies. It came off the back of an escalation in the sort of urgency of the rhetoric from scientists as well, I think, in the IPCC. So everything was pointing in the direction of travel. Most of us in the climate movement felt really encouraged by. And it is about the campaign energy for sure. And I think Extinction Rebellion and the school strike movement built on the campaigns from many decades previously and pushed it into a new space. But we can also see, again, with the same data that I just showed you, a collaboration with Cardiff University and Climate Outreach, 2019, we also see a long-term trend of reduced psychological distance. So people would frequently say 5-10 years ago that climate change is something that happens to other people in other places in the future. So a distanced kind of risk issue. And increasingly, the lived experience of climate change is such that we can see impacts around us. Media reporting has improved over recent years to make the link between climate impacts, extreme weather, and changes in the climate. So again, even on this measure, you can sort of finally see maybe that climate change is starting to hit home for people in countries like the UK, where rightly or wrongly it was seen as an issue for other people and not an issue for the here and now. But then we know what happened next. So we reached this kind of incredible point at the end of 2019, and then an unprecedented kind of global pandemic, certainly for people in most countries around the world, started to unfold. And yeah, as I said at the top of this presentation, as well as the usual range of emotions about what COVID-19 would mean for us and our health and our economies and everything that goes with it, I also had the strong feeling that we'd been here before. As I've just explained, we've kind of seen something similar. Economic insecurity, media and political attention, newspaper coverage falling off, this idea that there's a sort of finite pool of worry, we can only care about so many things at once. Can we care about a global pandemic and climate change and another key climate change UN conference on the horizon amidst all this uncertainty and with a lot riding on it? It's 5 years later after Paris. Glasgow COP has been postponed to the end of next year, of course. So, is history repeating itself? Short answer, no. But I think
yes, you
say
can.
lighter than that.
Of course, you can.
So, what this shows here is some polling done right at the beginning. Well, right at the beginning of lockdowns for many European countries. And it's a global poll from Ipsos Mori looking at the question of whether people perceive climate change to be as serious an issue as COVID-19. And in amongst that kind of peak level of fear and angst about COVID-19, you can see support for this idea holding up really well, I think, surprisingly well. Large majorities of people, not everywhere, but in most countries, agreeing, even at that moment early on, that climate change is as serious a crisis as COVID-19. What does it tell us? I think it tells us at a minimum that climate change is not so fragile in the public consciousnness that it can be easily dislodged, even by something as significant and unprecedented as COVID-19. And there's a few different ways of coming at this. This is data from a study by More in Common, who we're partnering with on a project called Britain Talks Climate at the moment, and I'll say a bit more about later. And More in Common surveyed people across Europe and in the States, asking people a bit later on in the summer, what did people want to see prioritized in terms of recovering from COVID or working through COVID-19. Obviously, health is a major focus. Obviously, unemployment and the economy is a major focus. But you see climate change and the environment coming in the top three for most countries in a way that I think wouldn't necessarily have been the case 5 years ago. So again, a kind of positive sign, I think, at the moment. It's obviously a long way to go, and as economic instability and insecurity starts to perhaps take prominence over the health risks of COVID, we may yet see this move around more. But for now, a snapshot for now, it seems to be in a better position than we might have predicted. This is UK data, again, showing that climate change stays high in the rankings of issues, social issues that people are concerned about, are worried about. This is polling from the CAST Centre, which Climate Outreach is a partner of. That's Climate Change and Social Transformations Centre in the UK. And this is from the same survey data from the CAST Centre, where we actually see something quite striking here, I think. The comparison is between August 2019 and May 2020. And you see that the percentage of people who think that climate change requires an extremely high level of urgency in terms of response, or a high level of urgency, has actually increased over this period. It hasn't decreased. So I think at a minimum, we're not seeing climate change falling out of the sort of finite pool of worry. People are concerned about climate change. They remain concerned about climate change, mirroring or perhaps even advancing on where public levels of concern were before. So kind of final point to illustrate this really, this is an update on a previous slide that I showed you from the Resil Risk project with Cardiff University. This psychological distance concept, is climate change getting closer to home? Are we already feeling the effects? And you see that we've added a 2020 update here. We reran some of these survey items, and an even higher number of people think that we are already feeling the effects of climate change. So it hasn't gone away. It hasn't fallen off a cliff, and we don't seem to have seen history repeating in the really problematic way that we saw at the end of the 2000s. So what does this mean? Does that mean we can all pack up and go home, safe in the knowledge that the carbon transition is well underway and we don't need to do anything? I think probably not is the answer to that, sadly, because the way that I would think about this is that all-time high levels of climate change concern staying where they are and reaching that level is a kind of starting point for public engagement that we really needed to be at 10, maybe even 20 years ago, if we wanted to make life easier for ourselves in terms of the speed of transition. So I think if you step back and you think across the different dimensions of life, the way that we use land, grow food, consume material products, power our homes, travel, almost everything that you can think of, needs to be updated, adjusted, transitioned in light of the commitments that we need to make ourselves on our carbon emissions. And so in that context, a stable recognition as an urgent issue is about the least, I think, that we could hope for in terms of a starting point for public engagement. So it's great that climate change concern levels are high. It's important that we keep them there and don't lose that sort of broad-based level of concern on climate change. But there's an awful lot to do to deepen that concern into kind of conviction and a commitment to the kinds of policy, societal, individual, community level actions that we need to see right across the board. And this speaks to comments that were made in the introduction to this presentation. Fundamentally, that means getting beyond kind of, building awareness and understanding, providing information about climate science and climate risks, and even getting beyond talking about how urgent the situation is. It means really getting to the level of connecting climate change through the stories that we tell, the narratives that we shape around this issue to diverse public values, essentially. And our values, I think most of us have an understanding of what they are, but they're the things that matter to us. They guide our views about almost everything, any particular issue, whether that's kind of, immigration or climate change. Our values are what predict our views on a whole range of different issues. And we have a sort of phrase that we use at Climate Outreach, which says that effective communication on climate change is not so much about the big numbers of climate change, like 2 degrees, global temperatures, or the parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's not about kind of coming down from those big numbers and talking to people. It's about starting from people's values and building a story upwards from there about what climate change is, what it means to people, and showing that they are part of that story. That's a story that they are shaping, not something that happens around them. And we've done a fair amount of work essentially asking, how do we beyond the usual suspects? How do we engage across the political spectrum? Because in a way, the easy thing to do is to focus on the people who already largely agree with the urgency, the importance of climate change. The harder thing to do is to convince people who are yet to be persuaded that this is significant, serious, and should matter to them as well as to other people. But we've done quite a bit of work essentially asking, how do you have a better conversation with people with centre-right political views, small c conservatives on climate change, less so in non-Anglophone countries, but certainly, very obviously in the US and Australia, there's a real polarization on climate change between left and right. And the UK, we've had a kind of soft version of that. We've managed to avoid, I would say for now, that kind of polarization and division that we see in other English-speaking countries. But part of how we've managed to avoid that, I think, is by committing to a sort of approach to public engagement that does try to reach out and be inclusive. So you start by asking, what are the values of conservatives, people who hold centre-right views that might sort of chime with sustainability and might fit with climate change? It could be things like being pragmatic, taking a sort of common sense approach, being prepared for things that might come down the line. That's the sort of starting point for conservative philosophy. It's a starting point for building mitigation and adaptation action on climate change. Maybe it's about avoiding wastefulness, not wasting food, not wasting energy, not wasting time and money. That's a good principle. It's a solid kind of centre-right principle for approaching a whole range of situations. And it's something that has a lot of resonance for sustainability and for energy saving in particular. And it's also something that resonates well across the political spectrum. I think that's important to think about. we want to understand how different groups feel on climate change, but partly we want to understand those different groups so that we can find the common currency to engage, across those differences rather than necessarily, enhancing them. And if we are going to get beyond the usual suspects and we are going to commit to a kind of really broad based social mandate building on climate change, then that means not just kind of top-down campaigns and slogans. It means climate conversations. It means sort of peer dialogue, and it means sort of deliberative public engagement, where you get people together, you sit them down, you invite them to talk about their values, who they are, what they care about, how they see their future, and where climate change fits into that. I think this idea of talking climate conversations is a really, really crucial part of how we respond to climate change. We need to make it real for ourselves and allow ourselves, and especially people who are not close to the climate policy world, to just really become comfortable and familiar with what the nature of the changes that need to happen are, but also to shape those pathways. I think, in France, in Ireland, and in England recently as well, we've had citizens' assemblies on climate change, which have produced really powerful statements, I think, about public attitudes, and really do speak to that idea of a social mandate. You can read it off from these deliberative exercises. You can start seeing where the value trade-offs come in, and that's absolutely crucial. And I think they also provide a space for moving from the really needed sort of platform of urgency that a lot of climate campaigners have provided in recent years, and away from, I guess, a drift into fatalism, which can come with that as well. So this old balance between sort of hope and fear that has been there for climate change communication since the very beginning. We need to be honest about the magnitude of the risks that we face, but we don't want to switch ourselves off by kind of causing people to feel fatalistic, or that there's nothing that they can do about it, or that it's too late. So this idea of kind of collective efficacy, that what you do makes a difference, that when we act together it makes a difference, is really important. And partly that is achieved by pointing to and engaging people on practical steps that they can take, as we're honest about the seriousness of the risks. And here I think there's a direct kind of learning from COVID-19. I mean, different groups of people experienced this pandemic so far in very different ways. Some people saw some silver linings in there, and they connected with nature, and they heard birdsong, and they saw the empty roads as a sign of what the green future could be. Other people didn't really take any positives from it at all, and were just very worried and scared for their future in terms of their job and their future prospects for them and their family. But the one thing that we can point to, I think, that universally was shared, is that we saw that we were able to kind of act together in pursuit of a shared avoiding a shared risk. And that's kind of existence proof of how linked individual behavior and lifestyle changes are with those more systemic policy shifts, which is something we talk about in climate change. But perhaps it's not so easy to understand how those two things are linked together. I think COVID shows how clearly those two things are linked together, that only with public consent, only with positive social norms, only with individual behavior change can systemic changes actually be successful. And something that I mentioned right at the very beginning is just the importance of social norms. We spend a lot of time and energy paying attention to what each other is doing. Arguably, what made the COVID-19 lockdown regulations work was a sort of implicit social policing of the rules, rather than any kind of actual policing from authorities. And when those social norms start to change, or that social policing starts to disappear, it becomes harder to maintain, lockdown restrictions, and we've certainly seen that in the UK. But social norms kind of underpin attitude behaviour change. On climate change, we misperceive what others think on climate change. We underestimate how concerned people are. We assume people are more opposed to wind technologies than they actually are. So there's important campaign work, I think, that happens at that sort of social level. It's not just talking about how you as an individual can change your behavior, but really trying to make visible positive social norms on climate change as a way to sort of catalyze further engagement. So where are we? I'm sort of optimistically titling this after the pandemic, which we clearly aren't yet, and there's a long way to go. But I think the lessons apply now as much as they do when we finally have, whenever that will be, cleared the phase of this decade that is going to be dominated by COVID-19. We can see that climate concern remains high. That's reassuring, but it's a starting point, not an end point. It means that we've got a positive base, but we need to do hard work of deepening conviction and bringing in people who maybe just still see this as kind of quite peripheral to their lives, and they haven't connected with it at the level of their values, their identity. There's lots of good social science, psychology, guidance and advice you can draw on to make public engagement as effective as possible. But how do we engage right now and going forward after COVID-19 on climate change? And I just want to offer a few on that. I think no one has the rule book on this completely, but based on our understanding so far, I think clearly health risks have become a dominant sort of lens through which many other issues are now seen during COVID-19. That said, if you survey people in most countries in Europe before COVID-19, you still see that public health is right up there as people's priority. We did work in the UK through the Resil Risk project with Cardiff University, where we asked people before COVID-19 to kind of hypothetically assign tokens in a survey to different social priorities that they wanted to make sure were important part of kind of like climate adaptation policies. And what people pointed to time and time again was the health and well-being of citizens and protecting vulnerable groups. So this is safe territory. Health is tangible in a way that climate change, still isn't, even though the psychological distance has reduced. Climate change is the biggest health risk that we face. And I think beginning to join the dots now that health is so salient in the public mind is something that could and should happen through climate change communication. But people don't instinctively understand how climate change impacts on health. So we, as communicators, we do have to join those dots for people at the moment, whether it's things like urban heat making air pollution worse, whether it's, very young children and elderly people being at risk from extreme spikes in heat, whether it's the physical or mental impacts of, flood risks. The tangible health link is there, I think, and provides the obvious overlap with COVID-19 at the moment. I think cautiously optimistic that the logic, at least the basic principles of kind of green recovery and maintaining climate change as part of the economic and the infrastructure investment that's made now and after COVID-19 are broadly supported. But this graph is from More in Common research. I showed some of it earlier and said that we're collaborating with them and the European Climate Foundation on a project called Britain Talks Climate. And in that project, we take a really deep dive into 7 different segments of the British population, right through from progressive activists who see everything through a lens of climate change, to kind of nationals who are very focused on immigration, and to sort of left and right economically leaning disengaged groups who have really low trust in politics and institutions, and who are hard to engage on a variety of issues, but are hard to engage on climate change. And those 2 groups, they might well be the kinds of communities who we would expect, perhaps as campaigners, to be most receptive to the benefits that would come through kind of Green New Deal investments and jobs, and employment stability and health benefits. But they're actually, because of low kind of institutional trust, low political engagement, they don't believe that the benefits will come to them. They assume the benefits will come to other people. So there's a real job, I think, in bringing in those underrepresented groups to make sure that they do feel heard as we talk about pathways towards net zero, as we talk about Green New Deals. People need to see that we're going to make good on the rhetoric of kind of green recovery language, and to understand what those jobs are. I think climate change narratives they have the potential to bring people together. They can be unifying even at a time like this. Climate change is in Europe certainly, no longer, and in many places never has been, divisive in the way that other issues really are at the moment. We don't have to look far to see those. But people need to feel included in these stories. So if we're going to talk about pathways forward, they need to be credible. They need to have practical detail. They need to be seen as kind of authentic to people, not talking over people's heads. They need to map out a transition that's inclusive, that's fair, that moves away from a wasteful throwaway society. That's very safe territory, that's almost universally acknowledged, and again, common currency around kind of tangible health gains that climate energy can bring, building on the sort of elevated salience of health risks right now, are all kind of narratives and frames that I think can be effective on climate change at the moment, and build on what we know about climate change communication before COVID-19. But fundamentally, people need to see themselves in the story, and that can be taken very literally. The imagery that we use to illustrate climate change needs to show, diverse, relatable people, real things that can be identified with, not polar bears and melting ice, not great big farms of solar panels with no people. If we need to tell a human story about transition, then we need to show people in our climate imagery, as well as telling human stories in the words that we say as well. And I'll wrap up and leave you with the final thought. You see this coming up time and time again in UK polling at the moment, and I think it's countries too, but strongest in the UK from the research that I've seen. People don't want to go back to normal. They want things to change. So there's an opportunity here that I think wasn't there before, to sensitively and inclusively move forward in a way that perhaps wasn't open before. It's a moment of change. Everything's in flux, and people were not clamoring to go back to the life and the way of living they had, or certainly not as they experienced it. Life maybe wasn't that great for lots of people in lots of different ways. So I think inclusive and values-led public engagement can ensure this opportunity is not wasted. We can move forward in a way that that does build on diverse public values, does build that social mandate. If we keep talking climate, if we keep coming back to public engagement as one of the underpinnings of the policy levers and technological changes that obviously are going to be such a huge part of the transition as well. And if you want to know more about any of this, there's a resource that specifically talks about communicating climate change during COVID-19 on our website. But there's dozens of other resources and guides, as well as our climate visuals image library, evidence-based visual climate change communication to dive into. So take a look if you would like to learn more, and you can sign up for our newsletter too. And I'll be very happy to take any questions that anyone has. Thanks very much for your time.